5 cows landed in Israel. Within hours, security analysts in 3 countries flagged the event. Not because of agriculture, not because of trade, because these 5 red heifers could trigger the biggest geopolitical crisis in modern history, and because something required for biblical prophecy, impossible for 2,000 years, just became possible. The countdown has started. These aren't ordinary cattle. They're red heifers, completely red, no white patches, no black hairs, never worked a day in their lives, never worn a yoke or saddle, and according to ancient Jewish law, they're the key to unlocking something that hasn't happened since the year 70. Here's what makes this significant. The last Jewish temple was destroyed almost 2,000 years ago. Since that day, a specific ceremony required by biblical law became impossible to perform. Not difficult, impossible. This ceremony required the ashes of a red heifer. Without it, no priest could serve in the temple. Without it, temple service stops completely. For 20 centuries, this was theoretical. There was no temple anyway, but Jewish and Christian prophecy both point to a third temple, not as history, as future. Daniel wrote about it. Jesus mentioned it. The book of Revelation describes it. And here's the problem that scholars wrestled with for generations. How do you restart temple service without the purification ritual? How do you perform the purification ritual without a red heifer? And how do you find a red heifer when the requirements are so strict that only 9 existed in all of recorded history? The rabbis had an answer. They said the 10th red heifer would appear when the Messiah came, not before. It would be a sign, a signal, a marker that the prophetic timeline was moving. Then cattle ranchers in Texas, who'd never heard of this prophecy, started breeding red Angus cows. They were breeding for beef, for color consistency, for the American market. They had no idea that rabbis in Jerusalem were searching for exactly what was growing in their fields. The Temple Institute in Jerusalem has one mission: prepare everything needed for the third temple. They've made priestly garments. They've crafted temple vessels. They've trained men from the priestly tribe to perform sacrifices. They've done everything except solve the red heifer problem. Until 2022, 5 heifers, all red, all unblemished, all meeting the biblical requirements, transported from Texas to Israel, examined by rabbis, approved as candidates, and suddenly the impossible became possible. But this created a new problem. The Temple Mount in Jerusalem, where the ancient temple stood, is now home to the Al-Aqsa Mosque, the 3rd holiest site in Islam, one of the most contested pieces of land on earth. Palestinian leaders have stated that any attempt to build a Jewish temple there means war. Not protest, war. Intelligence agencies monitor the red heifers because history shows that Temple Mount conflicts don't stay local. They spread. The region ignites. And now there are 5 red heifers in Israel, aging toward a deadline. Jewish law says the heifer must be sacrificed after age 3, but before age 4. The clock is ticking. Preparations are being made. And very few people understand what's actually at stake here. What you're about to hear connects ancient biblical commands to current Middle East politics. It links prophecy to genetics. It traces a line from Moses to modern Israel. And it reveals why a handful of cows have nations watching. But before you can understand why this matters now, you need to know what was lost 2,000 years ago. The command came directly from God to Moses in the wilderness. Numbers chapter 19, and it's one of the strangest laws in the entire Bible. Speak to the people of Israel. Tell them to bring you a red heifer without defect or blemish, one that has never been under a yoke. That's the starting point. A female cow, completely red, perfect health, never used for work. Already, the requirements eliminate most cattle, but it gets more specific. The rabbis who studied this law added details from oral tradition. The red couldn't be broken by even 2 black hairs growing together. 2 white hairs disqualified it. Any blemish, a scar, a brand, even a rope mark, made it unusable. The animal had to be examined by experts who knew exactly what to look for. Why so strict? Because this wasn't about sacrifice in the normal sense. This was about purity, about creating something that could cleanse the highest level of contamination known in Jewish law: contact with death. In ancient Israel, touching a dead body made you ceremonially unclean. You couldn't enter the temple, couldn't participate in worship, couldn't perform priestly duties. Death contamination was serious, and the only solution was the water mixed with red heifer ashes. Here's how the process worked. The red heifer was taken outside the camp, outside the city, away from the regular community. A priest would slaughter it, while another priest watched from the Temple Mount. The entire animal was then burned, not just offered, completely consumed by fire. But they didn't burn it alone. Cedar wood went into the fire, hyssop branches, scarlet wool, all of it burned together with the heifer until nothing remained but ashes. Those ashes were then collected, stored carefully, protected, because they were rare and irreplaceable. When someone became contaminated by death, they used these ashes. A clean person took some ash, mixed it with fresh running water, and sprinkled it on the contaminated person. Once on the 3rd day, once on the 7th day. After that, the person was clean, restored, able to worship again. The system worked for generations. When Israel had the tabernacle in the wilderness, they had red heifer ashes. When Solomon built the first temple, the ashes purified the priests. When the exiles returned and built the second temple, they needed the ashes again. Jewish tradition records that only 9 red heifers were ever used, 9 in over 1,000 years of temple service. That's how rare they were. Moses prepared the first one. Ezra the scribe prepared another after the Babylonian exile. 7 others filled the gap between. Think about that ratio. 1,000 years of worship, millions of people, countless sacrifices, but only 9 red heifers. Each one probably provided enough ashes for decades, maybe generations. The rabbis treated these ashes like gold, more valuable than gold actually, because gold couldn't restore purity. The last red heifer was prepared sometime before the year 70. We don't know exactly when, but we know it happened before the Roman army destroyed Jerusalem and burned the second temple to the ground. When that temple fell, everything stopped. The priesthood scattered, the sacrifices ended, the holy objects disappeared, and the ashes of the red heifer, either used up or lost in the destruction, were gone. For the Jewish people, this created a theological problem that has lasted 2,000 years. According to their law, anyone who has been near a dead body is unclean. In the modern world, that's everyone. We've all been to funerals, we've all been in hospitals, we've all had contact, direct or indirect, with death, which means, according to the ancient purity laws, we're all contaminated. Without the red heifer ashes, there's no purification. Without purification, no one can serve in the temple. Without temple service, the entire sacrificial system stays suspended. Some rabbis argued this didn't matter anymore. No temple meant no need for temple purity. The synagogue replaced the temple. Prayer replaced sacrifice. Judaism adapted and survived without the red heifer. But other rabbis disagreed. They said the law still stood. The command still existed. And if God ever allowed the temple to be rebuilt, they would need the ashes. They would need purified priests. They would need everything to be done exactly as Moses commanded, which meant they would need a red heifer. The problem seemed unsolvable. How do you find something that only appeared 9 times in over 1,000 years? How do you breed for perfect redness when cattle genetics naturally produce variety? How do you ensure the animal never gets a scratch or blemish? For centuries, it remained theoretical, a religious puzzle without practical urgency. No temple existed anyway. The Romans had made sure of that. Then the Byzantines controlled Jerusalem. Then the Muslims. Then the Crusaders. Then the Muslims again. Then the Ottomans. Then the British. Jews weren't in control of Jerusalem. The Temple Mount was inaccessible for most of history. Even asking about rebuilding the temple was dangerous during certain periods. The red heifer question stayed in the study halls, in the commentaries, in the debates of scholars who discussed what might happen if the Messiah came. But they always came back to the same conclusion, recorded in the Talmud, echoed by Maimonides, the greatest medieval Jewish scholar. He wrote it clearly: the 10th red heifer will be prepared by the Messiah himself, not by human effort, by the Messiah. It would be a sign of his arrival, a proof of his identity, something impossible made possible by divine intervention. For 2,000 years, that settled the question. No Messiah meant no 10th red heifer. No 10th red heifer meant no temple service. The whole thing was locked in a sequence that required God to act first. Then, 1948 happened. Israel became a nation again after 2,000 years. The impossible occurred. A people scattered across the globe returned to their ancient homeland and declared independence. The fig tree, as Jesus called it, put forth leaves. 19 years later, in 1967, Israeli soldiers reached the Western Walls. The Temple Mount came under Jewish control for the first time since the year 70. Paratroopers wept at the wall. The shofar sounded, and rabbis began asking a question that hadn't been practical for 2 millennia. What if the temple could actually be rebuilt? Not in some distant Messianic age, not in theory, but in our lifetime, in the next generation, soon. If that was even remotely possible, they needed to solve the red heifer problem. They couldn't wait for the Messiah to provide one, at least not if they expected to prepare the way for his coming. They had to search, to breed, to find a way to produce what nature rarely created. The command hadn't changed. The requirements remained absolute. A red heifer without defects or blemishes, one that had never been under a yoke. The question was whether it could be done. Whether genetics and careful breeding could produce what ancient Israel found by rare chance, and whether finding one would prove to be a blessing or a spark that ignited something no one could control. But first, they had to understand why the search had failed for so long, why 2,000 years had passed without a single qualified candidate, why the 10th red heifer remained as elusive as the Messiah himself. The answer involved more than just cattle breeding. It involved exile, dispersion, loss of knowledge, and a gap in history that seemed designed to keep the red heifer out of reach, until everything changed. 2,000 years is a long time to wait for a cow, but the gap wasn't just about rarity, it was about impossibility. Multiple factors combined to make the 10th red heifer not just unlikely, but practically unreachable. Start with genetics. Cattle naturally produce color variation. A red cow bred to a red bull doesn't guarantee red offspring. Recessive genes create white patches. Black spots appear. Brown shades fade to tan. Getting pure, complete, uniform red is genetically unusual. The ancient Israelites didn't control genetics. They worked with what they had. When a red heifer appeared in their herds, they recognized it as providential, a gift, something rare that appeared when needed. 9 times in 1,000 years meant roughly 1 every 100 years. Rare enough to be special, common enough to sustain the system. But when the temple was destroyed and the Jewish people scattered, everything changed. The priesthood lost its function. The Levites dispersed into the general population. The expertise required to identify a kosher red heifer, the detailed knowledge of what disqualified an animal, that knowledge began to fade. Some of it survived in written form, in the Talmud and rabbinic writings. But the practical, hands-on experience disappeared. Jews in medieval Europe didn't raise cattle for temple service. They were often banned from owning land, restricted to certain professions, forced into ghettos. Cattle breeding wasn't part of their world. The knowledge of what to look for in a red heifer became theoretical, academic, something studied in texts but never applied. Even if a perfect red heifer had appeared in a Jewish community somewhere in Europe or North Africa, What would they do with it? There was no temple. Jerusalem was controlled by others. The animal couldn't be used. So why search? Meanwhile, the cattle themselves were changing. Different breeds developed in different regions. European cattle looked different from Middle Eastern cattle. Selective breeding for milk, meat, and work created animals that didn't resemble the cattle of ancient Israel. The specific type of cattle that might produce a red heifer, the genetic lines that carried that coloring. Those were scattered and mixed and lost in the general development of global cattle breeds. Some rabbis continued to discuss the red heifer in theoretical terms. What if one appeared? What would the requirements be? How would you verify it? The debates filled pages, but no one expected to actually find one. Not without the Messiah. Not without divine intervention. The Talmud stated clearly that only 9 red heifers had been used in all of history. Some rabbis interpreted this as a closed number. 9 was complete. The 10th would be different, special, messianic, not something humans could produce through normal breeding. This belief created a theological lock. If you believed the 10th red heifer required the Messiah, then searching for one yourself seemed presumptuous, maybe even wrong. You would be trying to force God's hand, trying to make prophecy happen on your timeline instead of His. So the centuries passed. Scholars studied the laws. Communities preserved the knowledge in books. But no one actively searched for a red heifer because the entire framework said it couldn't happen yet. Then, 1948 shattered the framework. Israel's rebirth as a nation wasn't supposed to happen either. For 2,000 years, empires had come and gone. The Jews remained scattered, dispersed to every continent, speaking different languages, separated by culture and distance. The idea that they could return, reclaim the land, and establish a sovereign state seemed as impossible as finding a red heifer. But it happened. Against historical odds, against military logic, a tiny population defeated multiple armies, absorbed millions of immigrants, revived a dead language, made the desert bloom, did everything the prophets said would happen in the last days. If that was possible, maybe other impossible things were possible too. The 1967 war accelerated this thinking. When Israeli soldiers took the old city of Jerusalem and reached the Temple Mount, something shifted in Jewish consciousness. The Western Wall, the last remaining part of the Second Temple complex, was accessible again. Jews could pray there, touch the ancient stones, stand where their ancestors had stood. Rabbi Shlomo Goren, the chief rabbi of the Israeli military, arrived at the Temple Mount with a shofar and a Torah scroll. He wanted to establish a synagogue there immediately. He believed the time had come. The government stopped him for political reasons, but the desire was real. And if the time had come to reclaim the Temple Mount, then the time had come to solve the red heifer problem. The Temple Institute was founded in 1987 with this exact purpose: not to wait for the Messiah to provide everything, but to prepare everything so that when the time came, however that time arrived, they would be ready. They researched ancient techniques, studied archaeological evidence, consulted the Talmud and rabbinic writings, and they began recreating temple objects: the menorah, the altar of incense, priestly garments, musical instruments, everything described in the biblical accounts. But the red heifer remained the biggest obstacle. You can craft golden vessels. You can weave priestly robes. You can train men in sacrificial procedures. But you can't manufacture a red heifer. Nature has to provide it. Genetics has to align. And for 2,000 years, it hadn't. The Institute began searching. They contacted cattle ranchers. They examined herds. They investigated reports of red cows from various countries. Each time, the animal failed the test. A white patch, black hairs, previous use for work. Something always disqualified it. In 1997, they thought they had one. A red heifer, born in Israel, examined by rabbis, approved initially. Media coverage exploded. Prophetic speculation intensified. And then the heifer developed white hairs as it matured. Disqualified. In 2002, another candidate appeared. Same process, same initial approval, same eventual disqualification due to blemishes. The pattern repeated. Hope followed by disappointment. Rare red calves that seemed perfect until closer examination revealed flaws. The requirements were just too strict. 2 black hairs growing together, just 2, and the animal was useless for the purpose. Geneticists explained the problem. True uniform red without any other color is a recessive trait. Both parents need to carry it. Even then, the odds of completely red offspring without a single misplaced hair are low. And that's before you account for blemishes from normal life. A scratch from barbed wire, a brand mark, a rope burn. Anything that breaks the skin disqualifies the animal. One researcher calculated the odds for a red heifer to appear naturally, meet all biblical requirements, and remain unblemished until age 3. The probability was astronomically small, which explained why only 9 had existed in over 1,000 years. But the same researcher noted something else. Controlled breeding could improve the odds. If you started with cattle that carried the red gene, if you protected the animals from any work or injury, if you monitored them constantly, then maybe, just maybe, you could produce what nature rarely created on its own. The problem was finding the right cattle to start with. Israeli cattle didn't have the genetic markers. European breeds weren't quite right. Middle Eastern cattle had been crossbred too much over the centuries. Then someone noticed the red Angus cattle in America, a breed specifically developed for uniform red color, bred for generations to eliminate white patches and other color variations. These weren't temple animals. They were bred for beef, for the American market, for ranchers who wanted consistent appearance in their herds. But genetically, they were exactly what the search required. Pure red, uniform color, the right size and build. And because American ranching was different from other parts of the world, these cattle were often raised without yokes, without being worked. They grazed freely until slaughter. The Temple Institute reached out to breeders in Texas, explained what they were looking for, not in full theological detail. Most ranchers didn't need to know about ancient purity laws, just the specifications, completely red, no blemishes, never used for work. And the ranchers said they had calves that met those requirements. Several of them, born in the normal course of breeding red Angus cattle, not created for religious purposes, just products of a breeding program designed for color consistency. In 2022, after years of examination and verification, 5 red heifers were transported from Texas to Israel. 5 candidates, all meeting the initial requirements, all young enough to be raised properly, all genetically tested and physically examined. For the first time in 2,000 years, qualified red heifers were in the land of Israel. The gap had been bridged. The impossible had become possible, not through miraculous intervention, at least not obviously, but through modern genetics applied to an ancient command. The question now wasn't whether such animals existed. They did. The question was what would happen next, because having a red heifer and using a red heifer are 2 very different things. The sacrifice requires a specific location, a prepared altar, purified priests, and most complicated of all, access to or proximity to the Temple Mount, which brings us to why this matters beyond religious curiosity. Why do intelligence agencies monitor these cattle? Why security analysts track their age and status? Why do 5 cows make nations nervous? The red heifer isn't just about resuming ancient rituals. It's connected to prophecies that predict conflict, tribulation, and the end of the age as we know it. And those prophecies don't start with blessing. They start with a crisis. Understanding why the red heifer matters requires understanding what comes next in biblical prophecy. And that prophecy centers on one structure, the third temple, not the tabernacle Moses built, not Solomon's temple that the Babylonians destroyed, not the second temple that the Romans burned. A third one, future, still to be built, and according to multiple biblical texts, absolutely central to end times events. Start with Daniel. the prophet who predicted the exact timing of the Messiah's first coming, who outlined the rise and fall of empires, whose visions shaped how both Jews and Christians understand prophetic timelines. In Daniel chapter 9, he describes 70 weeks decreed for Israel and Jerusalem. Most scholars interpret these as weeks of years, 490 years total. 69 of those weeks, Daniel says, would pass from the decree to rebuild Jerusalem until the Messiah appears. Then the Messiah would be cut off, killed. History confirms this happened. Jesus was crucified roughly 483 years after the decree of Artaxerxes to rebuild Jerusalem. The math works precisely when you account for ancient calendar systems, but that's 69 weeks. Daniel prophesied 70. 1 week remains. 7 years still to come. And Daniel says something specific about this final 7-year period. He will confirm a covenant with many for 1 week. In the middle of the week he will put an end to sacrifice and offering, and at the temple he will set up an abomination that causes desolation. Read that carefully. Sacrifice and offering. At the temple, not a metaphorical temple, not a spiritual temple. The text describes physical sacrifices at a physical location, which means there has to be a temple where sacrifices occur. There isn't one now, but Daniel's prophecy requires one. During that final 7-year period, sacrifices will be happening. Then they'll be stopped, and something abominable will be set up in the temple itself. Jesus referenced this directly. In Matthew 24, his disciples asked him about the end of the age, about signs of his return. Jesus gave them a specific marker to watch for. When you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet standing in the holy place, let the reader understand. Then let those in Judea flee to the mountains, the holy place, the temple. Jesus was pointing forward to something still future even from his perspective, something that would happen in a temple not yet built, an abomination that would trigger the Great Tribulation. The book of Revelation adds more detail. Chapter 11 describes 2 witnesses who prophesy for 1,260 days, 3.5 years, the first half of Daniel's final week. Then it says, they were given a measuring rod and told, go and measure the temple of God and the altar, and count the worshippers there. But exclude the outer court. Do not measure it, because it has been given to the Gentiles. Again, a physical temple, an altar, worshippers, sacrifices. Not symbolic language, literal descriptions of temple activity. Paul writes about it in 5 Thessalonians. He's warning about the Antichrist, the man of lawlessness, and he says, he will oppose and exalt himself over everything that is called God or is worshipped, so that he sets himself up in God's temple, proclaiming himself to be God. In God's temple, not a mosque, not a church, the Jewish temple. The Antichrist sits there and claims divinity. This is the abomination Daniel predicted, the event Jesus warned about, the trigger for the final 3.5 years of tribulation. All of these prophecies, Daniel, Jesus, Paul, Revelation, point to the same conclusion. There will be a third temple. It will be operational. Sacrifices will resume. Then everything will go wrong. For Christians who hold a dispensationalist view of prophecy, this sequence is essential. The 7-year tribulation can't begin until certain conditions are met. Israel had to be reborn as a nation. Happened in 1948. Jerusalem had to be under Jewish control. Happened in 1967. And the temple has to be rebuilt for the Antichrist to desecrate it. That's where the red heifer enters the picture, because you can't have temple service without purified priests. You can't purify priests without the water of cleansing, and you can't make the water of cleansing without red heifer ashes. The red heifer is the unlock, the necessary prerequisite. Without it, temple service remains theoretical. With it, everything required for prophecy fulfillment becomes possible. Jewish eschatology approaches this differently, but reaches a similar conclusion. The return of temple service is connected to the Messianic age. When the Messiah comes, he'll restore the temple. He'll reinstitute the sacrifices. He'll rule from Jerusalem, and the red heifer is part of that restoration. Maimonides, writing in the 12th century, said the 10th red heifer would be prepared by the Messiah himself. It would be a sign of his identity, proof of his role. You can't fake it. You can't produce a qualified red heifer through normal means, or so the thinking went. Only divine intervention could provide the 10th one. But what if it appeared before the Messiah came? What if human effort, modern genetics, and careful breeding produced what was supposed to be impossible? Does that invalidate the prophecy? Or does it mean the prophetic timeline is accelerating faster than expected? These are questions rabbis debate today. Some see the 2022 heifers as providential, God working through natural means to prepare for the Messianic age. Others are skeptical. They question whether these cattle truly meet all requirements. They worry about presumption, humans trying to force God's timeline. But both groups acknowledge the significance. If these heifers are legitimate, if they can be sacrificed according to biblical law, if their ashes can produce the water of cleansing, then the barrier to temple service is removed. Now add the geopolitical layer. Because biblical prophecy doesn't happen in a vacuum, it happens in the real world with real nations, real conflicts, and real consequences. The Temple Mount is the most contested religious site on earth. Jews believe it's where Abraham nearly sacrificed Isaac, where Solomon built the first temple, where God's presence dwelt among his people. It's the holiest site in Judaism, the place toward which all synagogues face in prayer. But Muslims built the Dome of the Rock and Al-Aqsa Mosque there in the 7th century. It's now the third holiest site in Islam after Mecca and Medina, the place Muhammad is believed to have ascended to heaven. Palestinian identity is tied to Al-Aqsa. Any threat to it is seen as an existential crisis. For 70 years, this has been managed through a delicate status quo. Israel controls security. Jordan's Islamic Waqf manages the religious sites. Jews can visit the Mount, but cannot pray there. The arrangement is fragile. Violations trigger riots, rock throwing, sometimes wider conflict. The idea of building a Jewish temple on the Mount is, in current political reality, impossible. It would require removing the Islamic structures. That would spark immediate war, not just with Palestinians, with the entire Muslim world. Regional allies would abandon Israel. International pressure would be overwhelming. Yet prophecy says the temple will be built, somehow, at some point, in a way that current circumstances make unimaginable. Some prophecy teachers believe a peace treaty will make it possible. Daniel mentions a covenant confirmed for 7 years. Perhaps this treaty includes a provision allowing the temple to be built alongside the existing Islamic structures. A shared compound, 2 faiths on the same mount. Others point to catastrophic scenarios, a war that changes everything, an earthquake that destroys the Dome of the Rock, some event that removes the current obstacles and creates an opening for temple construction. A few suggest the temple might be built adjacent to the current mount, not directly on it. Archaeological debate continues about the exact location of the ancient temples. Some researchers argue the original site is north of the Dome of the Rock. If that's true, a temple could theoretically be built without touching Islamic structures. But all of these scenarios require dramatic change from the current status quo. And that's what makes the red heifer significant beyond religious circles. It's a step towards something that can't happen peacefully under current conditions. Intelligence agencies monitor the red heifers because extremist groups on multiple sides watch them too. Jewish groups that want to force temple construction. Christian groups that believe they can accelerate the Second Coming. Islamic groups that see any temple preparation as a threat to Al-Aqsa. In 2023, statements from both sides showed the tension. Palestinian officials warned that red heifer activities were provocative. Some Islamic leaders called them a sign of Zionist plots against the mosques. Jewish activists celebrated them as prophetic fulfillment. The concern isn't that moderate religious leaders will do something rash, it's that fringe groups might. A single extremist attack on Al-Aqsa, justified by red heifer prophecy, could ignite the region. A coordinated attempt to sacrifice a heifer on the mount could trigger an international crisis. This is why 5 cows are monitored like strategic weapons. Because in the hands of true believers, whether Jewish, Christian, or reacting Muslims, they represent more than ritual objects. They represent a prophetic timeline, a countdown, a belief that God's plan is unfolding and humans have a role to play in it. The prophecies themselves are clear about the sequence. The temple was rebuilt, sacrifices resumed, Antichrist revealed, covenant made, covenant broken, abomination set up, tribulation begins. Israel was persecuted. Nations gathered against Jerusalem. Messiah returns, kingdom established. That's the framework. Debated in details, but consistent in broad strokes across Jewish and Christian eschatology. And the red heifer sits at the beginning of that sequence. Not the trigger necessarily, but an enabler, a piece that makes other pieces possible. For 2,000 years, that piece was missing. The sequence couldn't start because the prerequisites weren't met. Now they might be. 5 heifers in Israel, a temple institute with blueprints ready, trained priests waiting. Political conditions are unstable enough that dramatic change seems possible. The question isn't whether the prophecies exist. They're written, preserved for millennia. The question is whether we're seeing them move from text to reality, from future to present, from prediction to fulfillment, and whether that fulfillment comes through divine miracle or human effort to force God's hand. Because there's a critical difference between prophecy unfolding according to God's timing and humans manipulating events to make prophecy appear to unfold. One is faith, the other is presumption. And the consequences of getting it wrong could be catastrophic. But before we can assess what's happening now, we need to understand how we got here, how the modern search for red heifers began, who's involved, what their motivations are, and how Texas ranchers became part of a prophetic drama they never anticipated. The Temple Institute didn't start as a prophecy organization. It started as a research project. In 1987, Rabbi Yisrael Ariel founded the Institute with a straightforward mission: study everything the Bible says about the temple and recreate it, not symbolically. Actually, build the menorah according to exact specifications. Weave the priestly garments from the right materials. Craft the vessels using ancient techniques. Rabbi Ariel had personal history with the Temple Mount. He was one of the paratroopers who reached the Western Wall in 1967. He stood there when Israel regained access to the holiest site in Judaism, and he believed that access wasn't accidental. It was providential, a sign that the time was approaching for temple restoration. But he also knew you couldn't just build a temple overnight. The knowledge had been lost, the expertise scattered. Objects described in Exodus and Leviticus hadn't been made in 2,000 years. Someone needed to figure out how. So the Institute became part research center, part workshop, part museum. They studied ancient texts, consulted archaeologists, brought in craftsmen and artists, and slowly, piece by piece, they recreated temple objects. The golden menorah took years. It had to be pure gold, hammered from a single piece. 70 pounds of precious metal shaped according to the pattern Moses saw on the mountain. When it was finished, it was worth over $3 million, and it sits ready, waiting for a temple to place it in. The priestly garments required even more research. The Bible describes specific colors: blue from a certain snail, purple from another source, fabrics woven in particular patterns, gemstones for the breastplate, a crown of pure gold. Every detail mattered because the priests couldn't serve in ordinary clothes. The Institute trained men from families with priestly lineage, the Kohanim, descendants of Aaron. DNA studies have identified genetic markers that track through these family lines. Men who carry those markers have been taught the sacrificial procedures: how to slaughter, how to burn, how to handle blood and fat, and grain offerings. They practice with replicas. They memorize the rituals. They prepare for a day when there might actually be a temple to serve in. But all of this preparation hit one immovable obstacle: the red heifer. You can craft golden vessels without a temple. You can weave priestly robes in a workshop. You can train men in sacrificial procedures using simulations, but you can't fake ritual purity. You can't pretend the priests are cleansed from death contamination when the cleansing agent doesn't exist. Without red heifer ashes, every priest in Israel is ceremonially unclean, which means even if a temple appeared tomorrow, no one could serve in it. The whole system stays locked. Rabbi Chaim Richman took on the red heifer challenge. He became the Institute's international director and the primary spokesperson on this issue. He understood the bottleneck. Everything else was ready, or could be made ready quickly. This one thing remained impossible. So he started searching, researching, reaching out to cattle experts worldwide. The first challenge was understanding what made a red heifer biblically qualified. The Torah gives basic requirements. The rabbis added layers of detail from oral tradition. But practical application was another matter. No one alive had ever actually examined a candidate for temple use. Richmond studied the Talmudic tractate Para, the section dealing specifically with the red heifer. He learned that the red had to be a specific shade, like the clay of the earth, reddish-brown, not orange, not pink, the color of soil. He learned that even the slightest variation disqualified the animal. 2 white hairs growing from the same follicle, disqualified. A black spot smaller than a lentil, disqualified. Any scar or blemish that broke the hide, disqualified. And he learned about the yoke requirement. The animal could never have been used for work, never pulled a plow, never carried a burden, never been ridden. In ancient times, this was normal. Cattle were raised for various purposes, and some were never put to work. In the modern world, it was unusual, but not impossible. Armed with this knowledge, Richmond began investigating reports of red cattle. Someone in Mississippi claimed to have one. Richmond traveled there. The animal had white patches, disqualified. A rancher in Texas mentioned red calves in his herd, examined them, black hairs, disqualified. The 1997 candidate in Israel generated worldwide attention. A red heifer, born near Haifa, examined by rabbis, initially approved. The Institute prepared for the possibility. Media coverage exploded. Prophecy teachers pointed to it as a sign. And then the heifer matured and developed white hairs. The whole thing collapsed. Richmond realized something. Waiting for a red heifer to appear naturally wasn't a strategy. The odds were too low. The requirements are too strict. If they were going to find one, they needed to actively breed for it. But Israeli cattle weren't suitable. The genetic lines didn't favor solid red coloring. Crossbreeding with European and local Middle Eastern cattle had created too much variation. Starting with Israeli stock would take generations to isolate the red gene and eliminate other colors. They needed cattle already bred for uniform red, which led them to America, specifically to Red Angus cattle. Red Angus is a breed developed in the United States specifically for consistent red color. It started as a variant of Black Angus. Some Angus cattle carried a recessive red gene. When 2 carriers bred, some offspring were red instead of black. Ranchers noticed these red cattle had the same meat quality as Black Angus, same temperament, same growth rate, but a different appearance. Some buyers preferred the look, so breeders began selecting for red. They bred red to red, eliminating black from the genetic line. Over generations, they created a strain that bred true for red color. By the late 20th century, Red Angus was an established breed, registered, standardized, and genetically consistent for the one trait the Temple Institute needed most: solid, uniform red color. Richmond contacted Red Angus breeders in Texas. He explained what he was looking for, though not all the theological background. Completely red, no white patches, no black hairs, never used for work. Born naturally, not through artificial insemination if possible. The ranchers understood the specifications, even if they didn't fully grasp why, and they said yes. they had calves that met those standards. Red Angus breeding naturally produced what the Institute needed. The cattle were raised for beef, not work. They grazed freely. As long as the animals avoided injury, they would remain unblemished. But there was a complication. American cattle and Israeli cattle don't mix easily in terms of import regulations, disease concerns, quarantine requirements, veterinary standards. Getting live cattle from Texas to Israel wasn't simple. It took years to navigate the logistics, years of examinations and certifications, years of monitoring candidate calves to ensure they didn't develop disqualifying marks as they matured, years of genetic testing and rabbinic approval. Meanwhile, other organizations joined the effort. B'nai Israel, a group focused on training priests, supported the search. Christian ministries that believed in the prophetic significance provided funding. The project became international. Ranchers in Texas, rabbis in Jerusalem, donors in America, all working toward the same goal. In 2018, the Institute announced they had identified 5 promising candidates, all born in Texas, all from Red Angus stock, all meeting initial visual requirements. But the cattle were still young. They needed to mature enough to ensure the color held and no blemishes developed, and they needed to be transported to Israel. The planning took 4 more years. Veterinary clearances, transport arrangements, a location in Israel to house them. Security considerations. These weren't ordinary cattle, and threats had been made. Everything had to be coordinated carefully. And then, in September 2022, it happened. 5 red heifers boarded a plane in Texas and flew to Israel, not as cargo, as religiously significant animals that represented 2,000 years of waiting. When they landed, the Institute examined them again, still completely red, still unblemished, still qualified by all known standards. They were moved to a secure location in the Judean wilderness, a place where they could graze without risk of injury, where they could be monitored constantly, where they could age toward the window of eligibility. Rabbi Richman made the announcement carefully. These were candidates, not certainties. They still had to reach age 3 without developing disqualifying marks. They still had to be examined by a full rabbinical court. They still had to pass final approval before any sacrifice could be attempted. But for the first time in 2,000 years, Israel had multiple qualified red heifer candidates on its soil. Not 1, 5. The odds of all 5 failing seemed low. At least 1 or 2 should remain eligible through the required age. The Temple Institute began preparing the next steps. An altar had to be built. The location chosen carefully, not on the Temple Mount itself, which was impossible politically, but in a place that met halakhic requirements. The Mount of Olives, east of the Temple Mount, was identified as suitable. Priests had to be selected and purified as much as possible without the ashes. Training intensified. The exact procedure for the sacrifice was reviewed and rehearsed. Every step mattered. This couldn't be done casually or incorrectly, and a timeline emerged. The heifers were born in 2018 to 2019. They needed to be at least 3 years old, but not yet 4. That created a window. Spring 2022 was too early. Spring 2025 would be too late. Somewhere in between, late 2024 or early 2025, the sacrifice would need to happen, which meant the countdown had started, not in centuries or generations, in months, less than 2 years from the current moment to the deadline. The modern search that had taken decades was approaching its conclusion. Texas ranchers who bred cattle for beef had unknowingly provided what ancient Israel found by rare providence. Modern genetics had accomplished what 2,000 years of waiting could not. The question now shifted from whether red heifers existed to whether they would actually be used, and what would happen when they were. Because the search was one thing, the sacrifice would be another. That would be public, visible, controversial. It would cross a line from preparation to action, from theoretical to actual. And it would signal that those who believe the prophetic timeline is advancing aren't just watching anymore. They're participating, pushing, making it happen. Whether that's faith or presumption would depend on who you asked. But the consequences would affect everyone in the region, and possibly far beyond. September 15th, 2022. Ben Gurion Airport, Tel Aviv. A cargo shipment arrived from the United States that most travelers wouldn't have noticed. 5 red heifers, loaded in specialized transport crates, accompanied by veterinary certificates, cleared through agricultural inspection. But this wasn't ordinary livestock importation. Within hours of landing, the arrival was announced publicly. News outlets in Israel picked up the story, then international media, then prophecy-focused websites and YouTube channels. Within days, millions of people knew that 5 red heifers from Texas were now in Israel. The Temple Institute released an official statement. After years of searching, they had successfully brought qualified candidates to the land. Each heifer met the biblical requirements for color and condition. Each had been examined multiple times during the selection process. Each represented a potential fulfillment of the ancient command that had seemed impossible to fulfill. Rabbi Richman appeared in videos explaining the significance. These weren't just any red cattle. They were candidates for the most important ritual in temple preparation, the ritual that unlocks everything else. Without this, there could be no purified priests. Without purified priests, there could be no temple service. This was the key. The heifers were transported to a secure location in the Judean wilderness, not disclosed publicly for security reasons, a place where they could be monitored 24 hours a day, protected from injury, examined regularly for any developing marks or blemishes that might disqualify them. The Institute set up cameras, live feeds that donors could access to watch the heifers, see them grazing, confirm they still appeared completely red. The transparency was intentional. This was too important to leave to faith alone. People wanted to see the evidence themselves. Rabbinic authorities began the formal examination process. The requirements from Talmudic law are specific. The examining rabbi must be an expert. He must check the entire animal, look for any disqualifying marks. Even 2 hairs of the wrong color growing from a single follicle would eliminate the animal from consideration. The examination isn't a one-time event. It's ongoing. As the animal ages, changes can occur. Hair that was solidly red at age 1 might show variation at age 2. A scar might form from an injury. A blemish might develop. So the heifers have to be checked repeatedly, documented, verified. Of the 5 heifers that arrived, initial reports suggested all 5 passed the first detailed examinations, all completely red. No white patches, no black hairs in significant numbers, no visible blemishes or scars. All still young enough that they had never been yoked or used for work. The ages varied slightly. Some were born in 2018, others in 2019. This created different deadlines for each. A heifer born in spring 2018 would reach age 4 in spring 2022. She would need to be sacrificed before that deadline, or she'd age out. But a heifer born in late 2019 had more time. This spread actually helped the planning. If one heifer developed a disqualification, others remained. If timing issues arose with one, another might still be in the valid age window. 5 candidates meant multiple opportunities to get it right. The Temple Institute was careful in public statements. They didn't claim certainty. They didn't declare that the prophecy was definitely being fulfilled. They presented the facts. 5 qualified candidates. Ongoing examination. The proper age is approaching. Preparations being made. But others were less restrained. Prophecy teachers saw this as unmistakable confirmation. For years they had said the red heifer was the missing piece. Now it wasn't missing. 5 of them were in Israel. The timeline was advancing. The end time clock was ticking. Christian ministries that support temple preparation are celebrated. Some had donated to the effort. They saw their investment producing results. The temple could now be rebuilt. The tribulation could begin. The second coming was closer. Videos flooded YouTube and social media. Red heifers in Israel. Prophecy fulfilled. End times alert. The red heifer has arrived. This changes everything. Biblical prophecy unfolding now. The message was consistent. This wasn't a small development. This was huge. The first time in 2,000 years that qualified red heifers were in the land of Israel, approaching the age for sacrifice. The barrier that had stopped temple service since 70 AD was about to be removed. Mainstream Jewish reactions were mixed. Orthodox communities that followed Temple Institute teachings saw it as significant, a step toward redemption. Others were skeptical. These cattle were bred by humans using modern genetics. That seemed different from the providential appearance of red heifers in ancient times. Some rabbis questioned whether American-bred cattle could meet the full requirements. Were red Angus cattle the same type as ancient Israelite cattle? Did breeding for meat production affect their ritual eligibility? These weren't simple questions, and different authorities gave different answers. But the most intense reactions came from the Palestinian side and from Islamic leadership. Palestinian news outlets reported the arrival with alarm. This wasn't neutral religious practice. This was temple preparation. And temple preparation meant one thing: an attempt to replace the Al-Aqsa Mosque with a Jewish temple. Palestinian Authority officials issued statements. They called the red heifers a provocation, an aggressive act designed to inflame tensions, a step toward demolishing the third holiest site in Islam. They demanded international intervention to stop what they saw as a dangerous escalation. Hamas, the group controlling Gaza, was more direct. Their statements warned that any attempt to sacrifice these heifers on the Temple Mount would be met with force. They called on Muslims everywhere to protect Al-Aqsa from Zionist schemes. Islamic scholars in multiple countries weighed in. Some dismissed the whole thing as fringe extremism, not representative of mainstream Judaism, unlikely to lead anywhere because the political obstacles were insurmountable. But others took it seriously. They saw coordination between the Temple Institute and certain Israeli political factions. They warned that right-wing elements in Israel's government might use the heifers as justification for action on the Temple Mount. The Waqf, the Islamic authority that manages the Temple Mount, increased security. They were already on high alert due to previous tensions. But the red heifer arrival added a new concern. Groups that had seemed theoretical now had actual tools for their agenda. Intelligence agencies took note. Shin Bet, Israel's internal security service, monitors extremist groups on all sides, Jewish radicals who want to force temple reconstruction, Islamic militants who will attack to prevent it. The red heifers became items tracked in threat assessments. A report leaked to Israeli media suggested that security officials were monitoring several Jewish extremist individuals who had made statements about the heifers. Nothing specific enough to arrest anyone, but concerning enough to watch. The fear was a unilateral action. Someone deciding to sacrifice a heifer on the Temple Mount without authorization, knowing it would cause chaos, but believing God required it. Similar concerns existed about Islamic extremists. An attack on the location where the heifers were housed. An attempt to kill or injure the animals to prevent their use. Security around the heifers was tight for this reason. American officials were briefed. The State Department's Israel-Palestine team needed to know about potential flashpoints. The red heifers were added to the list. Not immediate threats, but elements that could contribute to instability if not monitored. Through late 2022 and into 2023, the heifers matured. Updates appeared periodically on the Temple Institute's website and social media. The cattle remained red, still unblemished, still eligible. The countdown continued. In March 2023, Rabbi Richman gave an interview about the timeline. He explained that the ideal time for sacrifice would be when the heifers were in their third year, but before their fourth birthday. That created windows for each animal based on birth dates. The first window would open in late 2024. The last would close in mid-2025. which meant that within approximately 2 years of the September 2022 arrival, something would have to happen. Either the sacrifice would occur, or the heifers would age out, and the entire effort would have to start over with a new generation of cattle. The Institute prepared the location. An altar was constructed on the Mount of Olives, not a permanent structure. A ritual platform built according to Talmudic specifications. The exact spot was chosen based on sightlines to where the temple once stood. The priest performing the sacrifice needed to be able to see the temple site, even if only the direction. Priests were selected, men from verified Kohanic lineage, who had undergone as much purification as possible without the red heifer ashes. They practiced the procedure, the slaughter technique, the burning process, adding the cedar, hyssop, and scarlet wool at the right moment. Everything had to be exact. The logistics were complex. The heifer had to be transported from its holding location to the altar. This couldn't be done secretly. It would be public, filmed, documented. The moment word got out that a sacrifice was happening, reactions would be immediate. Would the Israeli government allow it? Technically, sacrificing an animal on the Mount of Olives wasn't illegal, but doing so as preparation for temple service would be politically explosive. The government would have to decide whether to permit, prevent, or ignore it. Would the sacrifice actually work? The procedure hadn't been performed in 2,000 years. The details came from ancient texts and rabbinic interpretation. What if something was wrong? What if the ashes produced weren't actually valid for purification? There was no way to verify except by attempting it. And would the ashes, even if properly produced, be accepted? The whole system of ritual purity rests on tradition and rabbinic authority. If some authorities rejected these ashes as invalid, the purification wouldn't be recognized. The divisions within Judaism about temple restoration could prevent the ashes from being used even if they existed. But these were concerns for later. For now, the fact remained. 5 red heifers in Israel, aging toward eligibility, protected and monitored, representing 2,000 years of waiting compressed into a countdown measured in months. The September 2022 arrival wasn't the fulfillment of prophecy yet, but it was the setup, the pieces moving into position, the impossible becoming possible. And everyone watching knew that what came next would be more significant than what had already occurred. Because finding the red heifers was one thing, using them would be another, and using them successfully would mean crossing a threshold that hadn't been crossed since the Second Temple stood. The question of whether that threshold should be crossed, whether humans should push the prophetic timeline or wait for God to advance it, that question divided even those who believed prophecy was real. But the heifers didn't care about theological debates. They grazed, they matured, and the deadline approached. 35 acres. That's all it is. A raised platform in the old city of Jerusalem. Stone walls built by King Herod 2,000 years ago. A flat plaza where 3 religions converge and clash. Jews call it the Temple Mount, Har Habayit, the holiest site in Judaism. The place where Abraham bound Isaac, where Solomon built the first temple, where God's presence dwelt in the Holy of Holies. The spot toward which every synagogue in the world is oriented. Muslims call it Haram al-Sharif, the noble sanctuary, the 3rd holiest site in Islam after Mecca and Medina, the place where Muhammad ascended to heaven on the night journey, home to the Dome of the Rock and Al-Aqsa Mosque, a sacred compound that has been under Islamic control for over 13 centuries. Christians recognize it as the site where Jesus taught and prophesied, where he overturned the money changers' tables, where he predicted that not one stone would be left on another, a prophecy fulfilled when Rome destroyed the Second Temple in 70 AD. 3 faiths, 1 location, and competing claims about who has the right to worship there and how. For the past 56 years, since Israel captured the Old City in 1967, the site has operated under a fragile arrangement. Israel controls security. The Jordanian Islamic Waqf manages the religious sites. Jews can visit but not pray. Muslims can pray and worship freely. The status quo is enforced rigidly because everyone knows how easily it could shatter. And into this powder keg comes the red heifer, an animal that represents Jewish aspirations to rebuild the temple on the mount where the Islamic shrines currently stand. The conflict isn't new. It's been building for decades, but the red heifer adds urgency. It removes the excuse of impossibility. For years, temple rebuilding remained theoretical because key elements were missing. Now they're not. The preparation is real, the timeline is active, and both sides know it. Start with the Jewish perspective. For 2,000 years, Jews have prayed for the temple's restoration. 3 times a day, in the Amidah prayer, observant Jews ask God to return His presence to Zion, to rebuild Jerusalem, to restore temple service. It's not peripheral. It's central to traditional Jewish worship. After 1967, when Israel gained control of the Old City, some expected immediate steps toward rebuilding. Rabbi Shlomo Goren famously wanted to establish a synagogue on the Temple Mount right away. He was overruled by political leadership. Defense Minister Moshe Dayan made a decision that shaped the next 5 decades. He left the Mount under Islamic religious control to avoid inflaming the entire Muslim world. Most Israelis accepted this, even religious Israelis. The rabbinical establishment actually forbade Jews from going onto the Mount at all. The reason was ritual purity. Since everyone is contaminated by contact with death, and since purification requires red heifer ashes, no Jew should step on the ground where the temple once stood. To do so in a state of impurity would be a serious violation. This prohibition served a political purpose too. It reduced tension. If Jews aren't even trying to access the Mount, then conflict is minimized. The status quo holds, but a minority rejected this position. They argued that some areas of the Temple Mount were permissible to enter even in a state of impurity, that Jews should assert their presence there, that waiting for perfect conditions meant never moving forward. These activists began organizing visits to the Mount. At first, small groups, then larger. They followed the rules. No visible prayer, no religious items. But their presence was itself a statement. This is our holiest site. We won't be excluded from it. Palestinians and Muslims saw these visits differently. They interpreted them as rehearsals for takeover, as attempts to establish a Jewish claim that would eventually justify removing the mosques. Each visit increased tensions. Riots erupted, rock throwing, clashes with police. The Israeli government tried to manage it through restricted access, limiting visiting hours, closing the Mount entirely during sensitive periods. But the pressure kept building from both directions. Jewish activists demanding more access. Muslim protesters demanded they be banned completely. Then groups like the Temple Institute emerged, not just visiting the Mount, actually preparing to rebuild the temple, creating the objects, training the priests, and now working to obtain red heifers. For Palestinians, this crossed a line. Visiting was one thing. Preparation for actual temple construction was another. That wasn't theoretical anymore. That was planning, organizing, taking concrete steps toward something that could only happen if Al-Aqsa was destroyed. The Palestinian Authority made their position clear. Any attempt to harm Al-Aqsa is a red line, not negotiable, not subject to compromise. The mosque and the Dome of the Rock are staying forever. Any threat to them justifies resistance. Hamas went further. They declared Al-Aqsa worth dying for, worth fighting a war over. Their 2017 charter specifically mentions defending the noble sanctuary as a core mission, and they've acted on it. Multiple conflicts with Israel have been framed, at least partially, as defending Al-Aqsa from Zionist aggression. The rhetoric escalated with the red heifer arrival. Hamas spokesmen gave interviews warning that the heifers represented a serious threat, not just symbolic, actual. They said Israel was preparing to demolish the mosques and build a temple. The red heifers were proof, the final stage of a long-planned conspiracy. Palestinian media ran stories connecting various elements. The Abraham Accords peace agreements with UAE and Bahrain, framed as Arab betrayal that would allow Israel to move on Al-Aqsa without regional opposition. Right-wing Israeli politicians making statements about Jewish sovereignty over the Temple Mount, presented as evidence of government intention. The red heifers, shown as the practical tool that made it all possible. The narrative became, Israel is preparing to destroy Al-Aqsa, has secured international cover through peace deals, and now has the religious components needed to proceed. The red heifer sacrifice would be the signal. The moment it happens, the assault on the mount would begin. This narrative is not based on actual Israeli government policy. The official position has been consistent. The status quo on the Temple Mount remains. No plans to change it. No authorization for temple construction. The government is trying to reduce tension, not increase it. But the gap between government policy and activist intention is where the danger lives. The government doesn't control every individual. Extremist groups exist that would love to force the issue, to create a fait accompli that the government would have to deal with. In 2023, several concerning incidents highlighted this risk. A group of Jewish activists entered the Mount during Passover with plans to sacrifice a lamb. Police stopped them. Another group smuggled religious items onto the Mount and attempted a prayer service. Also stopped. Each incident was small, but each showed that people were willing to violate the status quo rules. Israeli security officials worry about a coordinated plan, a large enough group, well-organized, moving fast enough that police can't stop them before they reach the Dome of the Rock or Al-Aqsa. An attack using explosives or fire, timed with a red heifer sacrifice to create religious justification. Such an attack would be catastrophic. Immediate riots across Jerusalem, throughout the West Bank and Gaza, in Arab communities inside Israel. The conflict would go regional within hours. Jordan and Egypt, despite peace treaties with Israel, would face massive domestic pressure to respond. The entire Middle East could ignite. This isn't speculation. History shows the pattern. In 2000, Ariel Sharon's visit to the Temple Mount sparked the Second Intifada. 5 years of violence, thousands dead. A politician simply walking on the Mount was enough to trigger that. Imagine what actually harming the Islamic structures would cause. In 1969, a Christian extremist set fire to Al-Aqsa Mosque. Not even a Jew, a disturbed individual acting alone. The fire damaged the mosque, and the reaction was global. Islamic countries convened emergency meetings. The Organization of Islamic Cooperation was formed partly in response to that fire. One man with matches changed international relations. Now consider what a coordinated Jewish extremist attack would provoke, especially one justified by red heifer theology and temple preparation. The war wouldn't be contained. It would spread. Intelligence assessments take this seriously. Shin Bet monitors Jewish extremist groups with the same intensity they monitor Palestinian terror organizations. The Mossad tracks international reactions. The IDF plans for scenarios where regional conflict erupts over Temple Mount violence. American officials have been clear in private conversations. Any Israeli action that threatens Al-Aqsa puts the entire U.S.-Israel relationship under strain. Arab allies in the region have stated flatly that they cannot maintain relations with Israel if the mosques are attacked. The pragmatic peace agreements built over recent years would collapse. So the Israeli government has every incentive to prevent Temple Mount changes. But that government is under pressure from religious constituencies who see temple restoration as a divine command, who believe the red heifers are providential, who think waiting is disobedience. Some of these believers are in the Knesset, members of religious parties that form part of governing coalitions. They don't represent all religious Jews. Most rabbis still forbid Temple Mount activity, but they have political influence, and they push for policy changes that expand Jewish access. In 2023, National Security Minister Itamar Ben-Gvir visited the Temple Mount multiple times. Each visit was controversial. Palestinians protested. International condemnation followed, but Ben-Gvir argued that Jews have a right to visit their holiest site, that the ban on Jewish prayer there is discriminatory. He's technically correct about the discrimination. The current rules allow Muslims to pray, but not Jews. That's unusual. In most holy sites accessible to multiple faiths, all can worship. The justification is that this prevents conflict, but it also entrenches inequality. The debate gets complicated quickly. Should equal rights apply even if exercising them triggers violence? Should minority religious claims override security concerns? Should modern political principles override historical arrangements that maintain peace? There are no easy answers, but the red heifer makes the questions urgent. Because if a purification ritual is performed, if priests are cleansed, if the next step becomes possible, then the pressure to move forward increases. Some temple advocates argue they don't need to remove the Islamic structures. Archaeological research, they claim, shows the temple stood north of the Dome of the Rock. If that's true, a temple could be built without touching the mosques. Jews and Muslims could share the mount. But even this peaceful solution assumes Muslims would accept a Jewish temple next to Al-Aqsa. They've stated clearly they won't. The entire compound is sacred to Islam. Having an active Jewish temple performing animal sacrifices 50 feet from their mosques is unacceptable. The very idea is seen as defilement. Other proposals involve dividing the mount. Jews worship at large. Dividing it meaningfully while keeping both communities satisfied is geometrically difficult and politically impossible under current conditions. A third scenario appears in some prophetic interpretations, a catastrophic event that destroys the Islamic structures without human agency, an earthquake, a war where missiles accidentally hit the dome, some occurrence that removes the obstacles while allowing everyone to claim it wasn't intentional. Daniel's prophecy mentions a covenant that makes temple sacrifice possible. Some interpret this as a peace agreement that includes a provision for the temple, perhaps a deal where Palestinians get a state and sovereignty over East Jerusalem, while Jews get permission to build on a portion of the mount. But crafting such an agreement would require Palestinian leadership to compromise on something they've said is non-negotiable. It would require Islamic authorities worldwide to accept a Jewish temple in Jerusalem, and it would require Israeli leadership to concede territory and sovereignty in exchange. The current political climate makes none of this likely. The gaps are too wide, the positions too entrenched. Neither side trusts the other enough for complex compromises, which means the most likely scenario for temple construction is also the most dangerous. Unilateral action during a crisis, a moment when normal restraints break down, when extremists act and governments respond rather than prevent. And the red heifer sits in the middle of all this, not causing the conflict that existed long before, but symbolizing it, focusing on it, making abstract theological arguments concrete. Because as long as temple restoration was impossible, the conflict stayed theoretical. People could argue about it without real consequences, but now it's not impossible. It's improbable and dangerous and opposed by almost everyone in power, but not impossible. 5 red heifers make it not impossible, and that changes the equation for everyone watching. The red heifer doesn't stand alone. Not in the prophetic framework that many Christians and Jews hold. It's one piece in a larger puzzle, one sign among many that believers point to as evidence that the end times timeline is advancing. To understand why the red heifer carries such weight, you need to see the context, the other pieces that appear to be falling into place, the convergence that makes this moment feel different from any other generation in the past 2,000 years. Start with Israel itself, the nation, the very existence of a Jewish state in the land of Israel. For 19 centuries, this seemed permanently impossible. After Rome crushed the Jewish revolts and scattered the population, the idea of return became spiritual, metaphorical. Jews prayed for Jerusalem in their liturgy. They ended Passover cedars with "next year in Jerusalem." But it was hope, not plan, dream, not strategy. Then the impossible happened. 1948. Against all odds, a tiny population, surrounded by hostile nations, outgunned and outnumbered, yet Israel declared independence and survived. The War of Independence should have ended in massacre. Instead, it ended with a state. Prophecy teachers point to Ezekiel 37, the valley of dry bones. God showed the prophet a vision of bones coming together, flesh forming on them, breath entering them, a dead nation coming back to life. And God said this represented Israel, scattered and destroyed, but destined to return to their land. "I will bring you back to the land of Israel," God said through Ezekiel. Not might, will, a certainty. And for 2,000 years, it looked like ancient history or distant future. Then, in one generation, it happened. The fig tree reference adds another layer. In Matthew chapter 24, Jesus used a fig tree as an illustration about recognizing the season. When its branch becomes tender and puts out leaves, you know summer is near. So also, when you see all these things, you know he is near, at the very gates. Many interpreters see the fig tree as Israel, tender branch and new leaves representing national rebirth. Jesus said the generation that sees this would not pass away before all prophetic events were fulfilled. If a biblical generation is 70 to 80 years, and the fig tree put forth leaves in 1948, then we're within that window. Barely, but still within it. 19 years after independence came 1967, the Six-Day War. Another impossible victory. Israel facing invasion from multiple fronts. Nasser of Egypt promising to drive the Jews into the sea. Syria shelling from the Golan Heights. Jordan controlling the West Bank and East Jerusalem. Then in 6 days, the entire map changed. Israeli forces reached the Suez Canal, took the Golan Heights, captured the West Bank, and, most significantly for prophecy, reunified Jerusalem. On June 7, 1967, paratroopers entered the Old City. They reached the Western Wall. Rabbi Goren blew the shofar. A colonel radioed the famous words, "The Temple Mount is in our hands." Jesus spoke about this moment in Luke 21. Jerusalem will be trampled underfoot by the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. For 19 centuries, Jerusalem was controlled by non-Jewish powers: Romans, Byzantines, Muslims, Crusaders, Ottomans, British. Then, in 1967, Jewish sovereignty returned. The times of the Gentiles fulfilled. Not completely. The Temple Mount remains under Waqf control, but Jewish authority over Jerusalem was restored for the first time since 70 AD. Another impossible thing made possible. These two events, 1948 and 1967, form the foundation of modern prophetic interpretation. They're verifiable, historical, not speculation or symbolic reading, literal fulfillment of predicted national restoration. But the signs don't stop there. The convergence goes deeper. Consider technology. Revelation 13 describes a system where no one can buy or sell without a mark. For 2,000 years, this seemed metaphorical or limited in scope. How could a government control all economic transactions? How could they track every purchase? Now we know. Digital currency, biometric identification, social credit systems already operating in some countries, smartphones that hold payment systems, identification, health records, and location data. The technology exists to implement exactly what John described on Patmos. It hasn't been fully implemented yet, not globally, not as a control mechanism tied to worship, but it's no longer impossible. It's not even hard. The infrastructure exists. The capability is proven. Only political will and public acceptance are missing. Revelation also describes the whole world seeing 2 witnesses killed in Jerusalem. Their bodies lie in the street for 3.5 days. People from every nation see them. In the first century, that was impossible. How could the whole world watch events in one city simultaneously? Television made it possible. Satellites, internet streaming. Now billions of people carry devices that can show them live events anywhere on Earth. When the Notre Dame Cathedral burned, the world watched in real time. When a pandemic started, global news covered it instantly. The technology exists for Revelation's description to be literally fulfilled. The same goes for the mark of the beast, a mark on the right hand or forehead required for commerce. For generations, this was mysterious. Now, implanted chips exist. Biometric scanning is common. QR codes can be tattooed. Sweden already has thousands of people with payment chips in their hands. The technology isn't the future, it's present. Move to geopolitics. Daniel and Ezekiel describe specific national alignments in the end times, nations that come together against Israel. Prophecy teachers have mapped these to modern countries. Ezekiel 38 names Gog, from the land of Magog, Meshech and Tubal, Persia, Cush, Put, Gomer, Beth Togarmah. These ancient names correspond to modern regions: Russia to the north, Iran, parts of Africa, Turkey, a coalition that comes against Israel in the latter years. For most of history, these nations weren't aligned. Russia was Christian, then atheist, not allied with Muslim nations. Iran was Persia, often in conflict with Turkey. The pieces didn't fit together politically. Now they do. Russia has deep ties with Iran. They cooperate militarily in Syria. Turkey, once Israel's ally, has become hostile. The exact alignment Ezekiel described is taking shape, not fully formed, not at war yet, but the relationships exist in a way they never have before. Daniel spoke of a revived Roman Empire, a kingdom that would emerge in the last days as a coalition of nations. The European Union often gets identified with this prophecy, a confederation of European nations centered in Rome's historic territory, rising to global influence. Whether the EU is the fulfillment or not is debated, but the fact that such a confederation exists, something that didn't exist for 16 centuries, fits the prophetic framework. The pieces are on the board in a way they haven't been since Rome fell. Then there's the Abraham Accords. Starting in 2020, Israel normalized relations with UAE, Bahrain, Morocco, and Sudan. Historic enemies making peace, economic cooperation, diplomatic recognition, a shift in Middle Eastern politics that was unthinkable a generation ago. Some prophecy watchers see this as related to Daniel's covenant. The prophecy mentions a leader who confirms a covenant with many for 7 years. Could the Abraham Accords be a foundation for that? Could they expand to include Saudi Arabia and others? Could a future leader take credit for expanding these agreements into a comprehensive Middle East peace deal? The speculation is just that, speculation. But the fact that Arab-Israeli peace is happening removes one more impossibility. It makes scenarios that require impossible political shifts suddenly plausible. Add in economic instability, global debt at unprecedented levels, supply chain fragility exposed by recent events, digital currencies being developed by central banks, talk of global economic coordination. The pieces for a worldwide financial system, controlled by a central authority, are moving into position. Moral and cultural shifts get attention too. Paul wrote in 2 Timothy chapter 3 about the last days. People will be lovers of themselves, lovers of money, boastful, proud, abusive, disobedient to parents, ungrateful, unholy, without love, unforgiving, slanderous, without self-control, brutal, not lovers of the good, treacherous, rash, conceited, lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God. Every generation has seen moral decline. That's not unique, but the scale and speed of current changes are striking. Values that were universal for millennia regarding marriage, sexuality, family, religion, overturned in a single generation. Not in small communities, globally, through media and technology that spread ideas faster than ever before in history. Jesus compared the last days to the days of Noah. People were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, up to the day Noah entered the ark, normal life continuing. People unaware of coming judgment. That description fits modern society. Life goes on. People mock warnings. The majority remains unconcerned. Natural phenomena get tracked too. Earthquakes, famines, pestilences. Jesus mentioned these in Matthew 24 as beginning of birth pains. Critics note that earthquakes have always occurred. Famines have always existed. True, but data shows increasing frequency and intensity in recent decades. Seismic monitoring has improved, which accounts for some increase in recorded earthquakes. But major quakes, magnitude 6.0 and above, have increased. The U.S. Geological Survey data shows this. Not every year, but the trend line rises. Famines affect larger populations due to global population growth. But the number of food crises has increased despite agricultural advances. Climate instability, conflict, economic collapse, multiple factors creating hunger in regions that should be productive. Pestilences need no argument post-2020. A global pandemic shut down the world, proved how vulnerable modern society is to disease, showed that ancient fears, plague, quarantine, economic collapse from illness, remain current threats. None of these signs alone proves anything. Earthquakes happened in the 1st century. Rome had plagues. Economic crises have occurred throughout history. But the convergence, or all of them, at the same time, with technology enabling global fulfillment of prophecies that seemed impossible, that's what prophecy teachers emphasize. It's the cumulative effect. Israel reborn, Jerusalem reunified, technology enabling surveillance and economic control, geopolitical alignments matching prophetic descriptions, peace agreements that were impossible decades ago, moral shifts at unprecedented speed, natural disasters increasing, and now red heifers making temple service possible. Stack them all together, and you get a generation that can legitimately claim to see more prophetic fulfillment than any since the 1st century. That's the argument. Not that one sign proves the end is near, but that the convergence of multiple signs, all at once, suggests the season Jesus told us to watch for. Critics respond that every generation has thought they were in the end times. The early church expected Jesus to return immediately. Medieval Christians thought the Black Death signaled the end. Reformation leaders identified the Pope as Antichrist. 19th century movements predicted dates that came and went. All true, all embarrassing failures of prophetic interpretation. But defenders point out a key difference. Previous generations didn't have Israel. They didn't have Jerusalem under Jewish control. They didn't have technology for global surveillance and economic control. They couldn't explain how the whole world would see 2 witnesses or how everyone would need a mark to buy and sell. Now we can. The impossible elements have become possible. The pieces that didn't fit now do. That's not proof, but it is different from previous generations' claims. The Matthew 24 discourse gets cited frequently. Jesus listed signs, wars and rumors of wars, nation rising against nation, famines and earthquakes, persecution of believers, false prophets, gospel preached to all nations, abomination in the temple. Then the end comes. Some of these have been constant throughout history. Wars never stopped. Persecution continued through centuries. But others are specifically modern. The gospel preached to all nations required global communication. That only became possible recently. Bible translation into nearly every language. Radio, television, internet, spreading the message globally. The abomination in the temple requires a temple. That's where the red heifer connects to the larger framework. It's not just about an ancient ritual. It's about enabling a prophetic sequence that can't proceed without it. If you believe Daniel's 70 weeks prophecy, the final week requires temple sacrifices to be stopped, which means they first have to start, which requires purified priests, which requires red heifer ashes. The logic chain depends on this one element. Remove the red heifer from possibility, and the whole framework stays theoretical. The temple can't be built. Sacrifices can't resume. The Antichrist has nothing to desecrate. The tribulation timeline can't begin. Everything stays frozen. Add the red heifer back in, and the chain becomes possible. Not certain, not immediate, but it is possible. The lock opens. The sequence can advance. That's why 5 cows matter. Not because cattle are important in themselves, but because of what they enable. The next step, the movement from preparation to action, from theory to reality. And when you stack that against everything else, Israel, Jerusalem, technology, geopolitics, economics, morality, natural phenomena, the claim of convergence becomes harder to dismiss as mere coincidence or enthusiasm. Maybe it is a coincidence. Maybe all these elements aligning means nothing. Maybe the pattern people see is pattern recognition bias. Humans are excellent at finding patterns, even in random data. But maybe it's not random. Maybe the convergence is real. Maybe the generation alive right now is seeing what prophets wrote about, what Jesus warned about, what apostles expected. The question isn't whether prophecy is real. Jews and Christians both accept that biblical prophecy exists and has been fulfilled historically. The question is whether we're in the window of final fulfillment, whether the signs are pointing to imminent events or just interesting coincidences that will fade like all previous prophetic excitement. There's no definitive answer yet. The proof will be in what happens next. Do the red heifers get sacrificed? Does a temple get built? Does a peace covenant emerge? Do the geopolitical pieces align further? Or does it all stall out? Do the heifers age past eligibility with no sacrifice? Does political reality prevent any movement on the Temple Mount? Do the current alignments shift and break? Time will tell, but those watching believe time is telling already, that the signs aren't subtle or debatable. They're clear and mounting, and the addition of qualified red heifers removes one of the last major obstacles, which brings us to the timeline question. If all this is real, if the convergence means what prophecy watchers think it means, then what happens next? And when? Timing is everything. And in this case, timing is biology. The red heifers currently in Israel are aging. They were born in 2018 and 2019. Biblical law requires they be sacrificed after reaching 3 years of age, but before turning 4. That creates a deadline, a window that opens and closes based on birth dates. For the oldest heifers, born in early 2018, the window opened in early 2021 and will close in early 2022. For the youngest, born in late 2000, the window extends into late 2023. But either way, the timeline is compressed, not decades, not generations. Months to a couple of years at most. This forces urgency on everyone involved. The Temple Institute can't wait indefinitely. Rabbinic authorities examining the heifers know they have limited time to make final determinations. Political leaders aware of the situation understand that decisions may be forced sooner rather than later. If the sacrifice happens, what follows? That's where biblical prophecy provides a framework but not exact dates. The most detailed timeline comes from Daniel's 70 weeks, 69 weeks, 483 years, from the decree to rebuild Jerusalem until Messiah appears. Then Messiah is cut off, killed. A gap of undefined length follows. Then the final week begins. 7 years of tribulation. That 7-year period is divided in half. 3.5 years of relative peace under a covenant made by the Antichrist. Then 3.5 years of intense persecution after he breaks the covenant and sets up the abomination in the temple. Revelation uses the same division, 1,260 days, 3.5 years for various events, 42 months for Gentile control of Jerusalem, time, times, and half a time. Another way of saying 3.5 years, for persecution of believers. The sequence is consistent across Daniel, Jesus' teachings, and Revelation. 7 years, divided at the midpoint, growing worse as it progresses, ending with Christ's return and the establishment of his kingdom. But when does it start? The trigger, according to Daniel, is a covenant. He will confirm a covenant with many for 1:7. A leader makes a peace agreement, not just with Israel, with many nations, a comprehensive deal that seems to solve long-standing conflicts. Is this covenant the Abraham Accords? Possibly. They're peace agreements between Israel and multiple Arab nations. They could be expanded. A future leader could take credit for brokering additional agreements. Saudi Arabia joining would be significant. Palestinians accepting a deal would be enormous. Or the covenant could be something still future. A deal we haven't seen yet. One that includes provisions for the temple, that allows both Jewish worship and Islamic control of the Mount to coexist somehow. A solution that currently seems impossible, but that a charismatic leader might achieve. Either way, the temple has to be functional during the tribulation because the Antichrist stops the sacrifices at the midpoint. You can't stop what isn't happening. So between the covenant and the 3.5-year mark, temple service must be operational. That's where the red heifer enters the timeline. The sacrifice and purification would likely need to happen before or early in the 7-year period. Priests need to be cleansed. The temple needs to be operating. Sacrifices need to be occurring. Some prophecy teachers suggest this sequence. Red heifer sacrificed, ashes produced, priests purified, temple constructed or prepared, covenant signed launching the 7 years. Sacrifices begin. 3.5 years pass. Antichrist reveals his true nature, desecrates the temple. Final 3.5 years of tribulation. Christ returns, if that's accurate. And if we're in the window of the red heifer sacrifice now, then the 7-year tribulation could begin within months or a few years of the sacrifice. That would place Christ's return within a decade of current events. That's assuming the framework is correct, assuming the interpretation is accurate, assuming we're actually in the prophetic timeline and not experiencing another false alarm like so many previous generations. But the implications of being right are staggering. They affect everyone, not just Jews or Christians, not just Middle Eastern politics, the entire world. Start with Israel. If the temple is rebuilt, Israel faces immediate war. Not eventually, immediately. Every hostile neighbor and many distant Islamic nations would view it as unacceptable provocation. The attack wouldn't just be from Palestinians, it would be regional, possibly global Islamic response. Israel's military is strong. They've won every major war in their history. But a conflict triggered by temple construction would be different. The Abraham Accords would collapse. Egypt and Jordan's peace treaties would be strained to breaking. Arab states that normalized relations would face domestic revolutions if they didn't oppose Israel. The prophecies account for this. Zechariah 12 describes all nations gathering against Jerusalem. I will make Jerusalem a cup that sends all surrounding peoples reeling. All the nations of the earth will gather against her. That's the predicted scenario. War, siege, Israel standing alone. But the prophecy continues. God intervenes, destroys the attacking armies, saves Israel, reveals himself to the Jewish people who then recognize Jesus as Messiah. That's the theological endpoint. Jesus returning to save Israel and establish his kingdom. For Christians who hold this view, the timeline includes the rapture, the catching away of believers before or during the tribulation. Interpretations differ on timing. Pre-tribulation rapture means Christians are removed before the 7 years begin. Mid-tribulation means removal at the 3.5-year mark. Post-tribulation means enduring through the entire 7 years until Christ returns. Each view has biblical support. Each has been held by respected theologians, but all agree that something dramatic happens to the church during this period, either removal from earth entirely or supernatural protection while remaining. Either way, the implication is that Christians alive during this time face either sudden departure or intense persecution. The mark of the beast becomes mandatory. Refusing it means inability to buy or sell, starvation, arrest, execution. Revelation describes widespread martyrdom, believers killed for their faith. For non-believers, the tribulation is described as the worst period in human history. War, famine, plague, natural disasters. A third of humanity was killed. Water turned to blood. Darkness, painful sores, demonic torment. The seal, trumpet, and bowl judgments of Revelation unleashed sequentially. The Antichrist rises to power, initially appearing as a peacemaker, the one who solved the Middle East conflict, the leader who united nations. But at the midpoint, he reveals his true nature, demands worship, kills those who refuse, sets himself up as God. This isn't symbolic language in prophetic interpretation. It's literal prediction. An actual person, actual events, actual suffering. The worst time in human history followed by Christ's return and the establishment of a 1,000-year reign of peace. That's the stakes. That's what the timeline points toward if the interpretation is correct. Now consider what it means if the interpretation is wrong. If the red heifers are sacrificed, ashes produced, and nothing prophetically significant follows. If the temple gets built decades from now, or never. If the geopolitical alignment shifts, and the current convergence proves temporary, then millions of believers have been convinced of imminent events that don't materialize. Faith gets shaken, credibility damaged. The next generation becomes skeptical of all prophetic teaching because this generation was wrong. Again, that's the danger of date setting and timeline certainty. History is full of failed predictions. William Miller, in the 1840s, predicted Christ's return. The great disappointment when it didn't happen. Jehovah's Witnesses predicting 1914, then 1925, then 1975. Each failure damages faith and credibility. Responsible prophecy teachers avoid setting dates. They emphasize watching, being aware, recognizing the season, without claiming to know the day or hour. Jesus explicitly said, "No one knows the exact timing, not angels, not even the Son in his earthly state, only the Father." But there's tension between "no one knows the day or hour" and "when you see these things happening, know that it is near." How do you watch for signs without falling into date setting? How do you recognize the season without presuming too much? The answer seems to be humility, presenting what you see, acknowledging you could be wrong, preparing spiritually without panicking, watching without presumption. And that's where we are. The pieces are in place. The convergence is real. The red heifers exist. The timeline is compressed by biological reality. But certainty remains elusive. What should people do with this information? That depends on what they believe. For believers who think the rapture is imminent, spiritual readiness matters. Not living in fear, but be prepared. Faith secured. Relationships are right. Living as if Christ could return at any moment, which is how Christians are supposed to live anyway. For those who expect to endure tribulation, preparation takes different forms. Spiritual strengthening, community building, understanding what persecution might involve, being ready to refuse the mark regardless of consequences. For Jews who see the Messianic age approaching, the call is to righteousness, to return to God, to prepare for the coming of Messiah, whether first coming or second, depending on whether they accept Jesus. For those who dismiss the whole framework, life continues as normal. These are just religious enthusiasts getting excited about nothing. The cycle of failed prophecy repeating, worth ignoring. But what if the dismissive are wrong? What if the convergence is real? What if we're actually in the final generation before everything changes? Then the cost of ignoring the signs is incalculable, missing the most significant period in human history because it seemed unlikely, being unprepared spiritually when the moment arrives. Pascal's wager applies here. The cost of believing and being wrong is minimal. You lived a faithful life expecting Christ's return. When it didn't happen in your lifetime, you still lived well. But the cost of disbelieving and being wrong is eternal, missing salvation, facing judgment unprepared. So the responsible position seems to be awareness without panic, watching without presumption, preparing spiritually while living a normal life, recognizing that if this is the season, readiness matters, and if it's not, readiness still matters. The red heifer sacrifice, if it happens, will be a marker, a moment when theory became practice, when preparation moved to action. What follows will either confirm the prophetic framework or refute it. Time will tell, but that time is compressed. The biological clock is ticking. Decisions are being forced, and within months to a couple of years, we'll know more than we do now. The question isn't whether to watch. Jesus commanded that. The question is what you do with what you see. There's a layer beneath the surface, a meaning in the red heifer that goes deeper than ritual and politics and prophecy timelines. The writer of Hebrews saw it. Chapter 9, verses 13 and 14. The blood of goats and bulls and the ashes of a heifer sprinkled on those who are ceremonially unclean sanctify them so that they are outwardly clean. How much more, then, will the blood of Christ, who through the eternal Spirit offered himself unblemished to God, cleanse our consciences from acts that lead to death, so that we may serve the living God? Read that carefully. The red heifer provided outward cleansing, external purity, ritual qualification to enter the temple and participate in worship, but it couldn't touch the conscience, couldn't change the heart, couldn't deal with the internal contamination of sin. Christ does what the red heifer couldn't. He cleanses from the inside, changes the heart, deals with actual guilt, not just ceremonial contamination. The red heifer was a shadow. Jesus is the reality. This creates a profound irony. The search for a red heifer to resume temple service misses the point of why the temple system ended. It ended because it was fulfilled, completed, made obsolete by something greater. Hebrews says this explicitly. When Christ came as high priest of the good things that are now already here, he went through the greater and more perfect tabernacle that is not made with hands. He did not enter by means of the blood of goats and calves, but he entered the most holy place once for all by his own blood, thus obtaining eternal redemption, once for all. Not repeatedly, not annually like the Day of Atonement, sacrifices, not every time someone became ceremonially unclean, once, finished, complete. The temple veil tore when Jesus died, the barrier between God and humanity ripped from top to bottom, not by human hands, by God's action, declaring access open. The old system is obsolete. Hebrews continues, the law is only a shadow of the good things that are coming, not the realities themselves. For this reason, it can never, by the same sacrifices repeated endlessly year after year, make perfect those who draw near to worship. Shadows versus reality, repeated sacrifices versus once for all, temporary cleansing versus eternal redemption. The entire Old Covenant system pointed forward to Christ. When he came, the purpose was fulfilled. So why rebuild the temple? Why resume sacrifices? Why seek red heifer ashes when Christ's blood accomplishes infinitely more? From a Christian theological perspective, rebuilding the temple isn't progress. It's regression, going back to shadows after the reality has come, returning to temporary solutions after the permanent one was provided. But prophecy says it will happen, not as God's ideal plan, as human rejection of his provision. The Antichrist sets himself up in the temple. He's not honoring God, he's opposing God, using God's house to claim divinity himself. The third temple, in this view, isn't a restoration of true worship. It's a stage for the final rebellion, a platform for humanity's ultimate rejection of God's authority. The sacrifices aren't pleasing to God. They're denial of the sacrifice that actually worked. This puts the red heifer in a different light, not as something God is providing to advance His purposes, but as something humans are producing to pursue their own agenda, trying to return to a system God declared obsolete, rebuilding what was meant to be finished. Jewish theologians would reject this interpretation. They don't accept that Jesus was the Messiah, don't believe the temple system was fulfilled by Him. For them, temple service remains valid. The red heifer is necessary. Rebuilding the temple is restoration, not regression. The divide is fundamental. Christians see the cross as the end point. Jews see it as irrelevant to temple worship. Both can't be right. Either the sacrificial system was fulfilled and finished, or it remains necessary and valid. But here's what's fascinating. Both views lead to the same conclusion about the end times. Both expect a temple. Both see conflict surrounding it. Both anticipate Messianic intervention. They just disagree about whether it's Messiah's first coming or second. And there's a mystery embedded in the red heifer itself. The ancient rabbis called it the ultimate chalk, a law without rational explanation. Why does burning a red cow create purification? Why does the priest who burns it become unclean, while those sprinkled with the ashes become clean? It doesn't follow normal logic. Numbers 19 verse 2 calls it a statute of the law, not a law with obvious reasoning, a statute, a decree, something you obey because God commanded it, whether you understand it or not. The rabbis wrestled with this. Even Solomon, the wisest man, said about the red heifer, "I said, I will be wise, but this was far from me." The greatest wisdom couldn't penetrate the mystery. Christian interpreters saw the mystery resolved in Christ. The paradox of death bringing life, contamination creating purity, the innocent dying for the guilty. The clean becomes unclean, so the unclean can become clean. It all points to the cross. Jesus, completely without sin, like the red heifer without blemish, never under the yoke of sin, like the heifer that never wore a yoke, sacrificed outside the city, like the red heifer burned outside the camp. His death created purification for all who believe. The scarlet wool burned with the heifer, the scarlet of Christ's blood. The hyssop, the branch used to apply blood to doorposts in Egypt, and to offer Jesus sour wine on the cross. The cedar, incorruptible wood, symbolizing eternal life. Every element pointing forward. If this interpretation is correct, then the search for another red heifer misses what the first ones were teaching. The ritual was never the point. The cleansing it provided was temporary and external. The reality it pointed to was eternal and internal. But prophecy says the search will succeed. The temple will be rebuilt. Sacrifices will resume, not because God commands it in this age, but because humanity rejects what God already provided and tries to establish righteousness through their own efforts. Paul wrote about this in Romans. They did not know the righteousness of God and sought to establish their own. They did not submit to God's righteousness. That's the pattern. Human effort instead of divine gift. Works instead of grace. Temple instead of Christ. The final revelation, then, isn't about when the red heifer will be sacrificed or what political events will follow. It's about what the red heifer has always represented: the insufficiency of external religion, the need for internal transformation, the pointing forward to something greater that the ritual itself could never accomplish. For those watching the red heifer developments with prophetic excitement, the question becomes personal. Are you trusting in religious observance or in Christ? In rebuilding temples or in temples not made with hands? In animal sacrifice or in the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world? Because if the timeline is real, if events are unfolding as prophecy describes, then time is compressed not just for red heifer biology, for human decision, for choosing which side of the divide you're on. The convergence of signs matters. The geopolitical situation matters. The technological capability matters. But it all serves one purpose: forcing the question that every generation must answer. Who do you say that Jesus is? What will you do with the provision God made? The red heifer can't answer that question for you. It can only illustrate it, show the difference between shadow and substance, between temporary and eternal, between human effort and divine accomplishment. 5 red heifers are in Israel. The examination continues. The biological window narrows. Preparations advance. Political tensions mount. Prophetic speculation intensifies. But beneath all of it, the same question echoes through 2,000 years. Why do you seek the living among the dead? Why return to the shadows when reality has come? Why rebuild what was finished? The answer will determine more than prophetic interpretation. It will determine eternity. Are the heifers graze in the Judean wilderness, unaware of the theology and politics and prophecy swirling around them? They're just cattle, red, unblemished, aging toward a deadline. But what they represent, intentionally or not, is the human choice that never goes away. Will you accept the provision God made, or will you try to make your own? The countdown continues, not just toward a sacrifice in Israel, toward the moment when every person must answer, and the time to decide may be shorter than anyone expects. September 2022. 5 cows landed in Israel. Within hours, security analysts in 3 countries flagged the event. Not because of agriculture, not because of trade, because these 5 red heifers